It is still unclear to this day why the Romans, tolerant of the divinities and religious practices of the conquered peoples, eventually came to harbor such a strong prejudice and hatred towards Christians, even deeming them the root cause of all the woes that befell the empire and persecuting them to the death. The history of the persecution and the clash between the Christian religion and paganism in the Roman Empire began with the death of Jesus, around 33, and lasted until Emperor Constantine's Edict of Milan, legitimizing Christianity only in 313. There were 3 centuries of ruthless oppression and non-stop systematic persecution of Christians by the Romans, but each emperor had his own way with the Christians. Some were crueler, others more tolerant, but all of them geared their choices towards obtaining the greatest possible political advantage, and these were almost never motivated by strictly religious reasons. From their very foundation, the Romans welcomed the divinities of the conquered peoples. They had no official religion, and their pantheon was gradually formed, often by adopting Greek and Oriental deities. Why, then, were the Christians persecuted for 3 centuries, until their cult was tolerated and finally enforced on everyone as the official religion? Experts have constantly pondered this question. The researcher Mary Beard argues that this persecution took place because the Christian God had no homeland. The Romans presumed that the deities came from elsewhere: Isis from Egypt, Mithra from Persia, Yahweh from Judea. On the other hand, the Christian God was heralded as universal, and the Christians spread the word. They were not content with being tolerated. They wanted to convert others. They were persuaded that this was their mission. Indeed, despite being one of the few peoples to rebel against Rome, the Jews spread throughout the world and settled in many of the empire's cities, coexisting with other creeds without too many issues, but certain of delivering truth and salvation to others through conversion. The Christians wanted to change the world. While tolerant, they were not willing to recognize other gods, and this extended to not acknowledging the emperor as a deity. At the start of their era, Christians perhaps numbered no more than a few tens of thousands, but they inhabited major cities and called the infidels pagans, rural, rude, backward people who needed to be converted to the true faith. The Romans simply could not stand all of this, especially the emperors, after all, who were considered divinities. Like all close-knit human groups intimately convinced of their superiority, the Christians were simultaneously admired, envied, and hated. Most of all, they were misunderstood, and they were viewed with suspicion. Not by chance, Nero thought of them when he had to find a culprit for the fire that, 64 years after Jesus' birth, had destroyed Rome. It was probably the best-known historical persecution, with famous victims such as the apostles Peter and Paul. But we ought not to think that Christians were hunted night and day. The odd religion was tolerated for a long time. Some emperors were repressive and condemned thousands of innocent people to death. Others showed understanding and humanity, including the unlikely Commodus, the Roman emperor who wanted to be a gladiator and was known for his outbursts and strange attitudes, who had a certain fondness for Christians. Christianity is a complex religion, with aspects that make it difficult to understand, accept, and tolerate. The Romans saw it as an inversion of their world. Yet another example of different interpretations of Christianity is its relationship with poverty. Instead of being a shame to be avoided, for Christians, the condition of poverty was seen as a virtue to be celebrated. Wealth, gold, quality food, and beautiful clothes were viewed as signs of corruption and sin. Instead of being fragrance, massage, sprayed with oils and essences, dressed, powdered, trained, displayed, and admired, the body was mortified as a symbol of matter, opposed to the only thing that really mattered, the spirit. And the cross, symbolic of the most atrocious and humiliating death, became a sign of redemption and salvation. The Romans crucified the people they deemed most vile and dangerous, and Christians knelt before the cross or traced it with their right hand on their own chest. Thousands died to remain faithful to their God. Christianity was the only religion that the Romans attempted to eradicate, but the spreading of its precepts by word of mouth between people about the new faith made it possible for it to thrive. And when one emperor, Constantine, understood that he could not destroy it, he decided that it was time to adopt it. He even stood to benefit from this new cult, as it could prove to be an extraordinary tool for validating the emperor's authority, as well as a formidable instrument of social control. By the early 4th century, the empire was exhausted, not by barbarian invasions or rebellions, but by civil wars. The real enemy was found within imperial borders and meant the collapse of internal cohesion. There were 15 emperors in the first 2 centuries, including Augustus. Without considering the brief civil war that followed Nero's suicide, there were more than 70 in the next 100 years. The empire had simply grown too big, and the emperor was no longer selected or adopted by his predecessor, chosen by the Senate, or, still less, by the people. He was the commander of one or more legions, acclaimed by the soldiers, and capable of subduing the others. Not surprisingly, emperors no longer resided in Rome. They wandered around the empire with their armies, for their authority no longer depended on the Senate or the people, the city or a deity, but on arms. This was the chaotic context in which Emperor Constantine decided to convert to Christianity. But why did he do so? He grew up when the Roman Empire was already divided into 4 parts, the so-called Tetrarchy. Constantine was the firstborn son of Constantinus Chlorus, one of the 4. When he inherited the throne, Constantine had to fight Magnentius, an emperor who wanted to reunite Rome. To become sole emperor, he had to defeat Constantine himself. At this point, Magnentius was in Rome, and Constantine was fighting in the east. That was when the latter's army advanced towards Rome. Something unusual was that many of his soldiers were not Romans, but Germanic. Constantine was still a pagan, but he was also somewhat of a religious man. As he marched towards Rome, he had a sign. On the night of October 27th, 312, Constantine had a dream in his sleep. The next morning, the emperor told his soldiers that the heavenly sign had come from in the form of a dream. A vision. A cross appeared to him, the symbol of the religion his predecessors had tried to uproot for Rome. He also shared that God had told him, under this sign, the sign of the cross, you will win. Magnentius fell into a river at the end of the battle and drowned. God's chosen Constantine had won. His next move was to flood the city with churches. We will never know if Constantine really had that dream, and moreover, we will never find out if he truly converted to Christianity when he won at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. Of the many unknowns in this story is the following. Did Constantine win because he became a Christian? Or did he become a Christian because he was victorious? The result is that the battle was bloody but brief. The Edict of Milan was promulgated in 313, stating that Christianity was a legitimate faith. The persecutions ended. Christians were free. More than this, they gradually began to take on power, because the religion that the other emperors wanted to suppress later became the official religion of the state. This happened in 380 by order of Emperor Theodosius I, who adopted the measure in a law known as the Edict of Thessalonica. The Edict of Milan was the genuine turning point. Theodosius merely sacramentalized a decades-long process, cementing the direction inaugurated by Constantine. He was a visionary. He chose Christianity politically when only 10% of the ruling population belonged to that faith. With this gesture, the emperor ended the persecution of Christians and paved the way for this faith to become the official religion of the empire and reach its limits, such as the British Isles and Egypt, for example.